Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV. HFO-TV is co-sponsored by J.R. Johnson LLC, specialists in multifamily restoration and repair work. Gantry Incorporated, the nation's largest independent mortgage banking firm. Butler Exchange Group, offering 1031 tax-free exchange services. And Forensic Building Consultants, experts in the diagnosis, repair, and preservation of multifamily assets.
All right, welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner at HFO Investment Real Estate. And today we're lucky to have with us the Oregon State Treasurer, Tobias Reed.
Hi, Greg.
How are you?
I'm well, thanks.
Also aptly running for governor here coming up next year. So congratulations on putting your hat in the ring. Maybe for people that don't know, I mean, it's a big position, but it's maybe not out there in the public as much as, locally that we hear and within the state. Maybe give some people some background on you, what got you into politics, and then we'll get into talking about the race and kind of what maybe some of the topics that are going to come up.
Sounds great. Well, I'm an Oregonian by choice. I came here for college and have mostly stuck around since then.
Okay.
And the Treasurer's Office, I think, is underappreciated, but it is really important. It's the state's chief investment officer, so we're responsible for the portfolio of the state, the largest portion of which is the retirement fund. But we invest all over the world to the benefit of our beneficiaries and the state. We also run a suite of financial empowerment programs, helping Oregonians save for college, for retirement, and for costs associated with disabilities. So it's a financial hub, really, for Oregonians and for the state.
And how long have you held that position?
So I was elected in 2016 and then reelected in 2020. This was after about a decade of service in the Oregon House, which I felt like was a really good preparation for that and a good preparation for the current campaign as well.
What pushed you into looking at becoming the treasurer versus maybe staying within the House or moving into the Senate within the state?
So I think the experience of being in the legislature was a lot like being in college. Committees are sort of like classes, and you end up having to create sort of a legislative major, the things that where you can create some positive difference and have some contribution. And the things that I ended up working on, because of my training and interests and where there was a need, aligned pretty closely with what treasurers do. So I found myself working with treasurers and treasury staff, and when there was an opportunity in 2016, I felt like I could take what I'd learned in the House to the treasurer's office, and that's been a great experience so far.
Good. So now we're coming into 2022.
Yeah.
We've got a governor election coming up. Maybe what's kind of inspired you to say, hey, I want to take on this role or look this where, I can bring some changes within the state?
Well, when we look at what's happening in the state right now, and we've spent hundreds of millions on housing, and it seems to be getting worse in some respects, when we have COVID straining our school system to the breaking point, when we have all of these challenges in front of us, I think what we really need is steady leadership to get beyond the pandemic and start articulating the vision for where we want to take Oregon, and not just for the next year or even the 5 years. It's really about the next generation. And from my perspective, I have a really simple way of measuring that. I want to make sure that we are measuring our progress as a state based on how well our kids are doing. That, I think, is the proxy for what kind of an Oregon we're going to have in the future. And the agenda, I think, is all about that, making sure that kids have opportunities for pre-kindergarten, a fuller school year, access to apprenticeships and vocational training, and that we're on offense when it comes to climate change so that we can be creating new jobs, being more resilient, and protecting this wonderful place that we're lucky enough to live in. And having the vision for that and the ability to deliver on it, to execute, to do the follow-up is, I think, something that distinguishes me from my opponents.
So one thing that you brought up was the measurables, and what's it measured by? And I know in our industry, there's always been question about what numbers. I mean, what are kind of is it graduation rates? Is it things like that? What are you looking at we'll stick on the on the student side. What are you looking at as the measurables which would garner success or show a success?
I think there are a range of them, but one that sticks in my mind really specifically is third grade reading. Okay. The number of students who are reading on target at third grade is highly predictive of their success in graduation and beyond. And one of the nice things about that metric is that you can look at it geographically and demographically and figure out where we're falling short. One of the great things about having a target, of course, is that it gives you a method by which you can adjust your policies. Is policy A or B better at moving us towards that target? And I think articulating that in a way that people can understand is really going to help us be more effective, one, but two, also help people feel like they have an understanding of where we're trying to go.
So not waiting till they're 18 or 17 in high school. It's almost, I have kids too. It's, if you're waiting that long, we've got to go earlier. And
dropouts start at that third grade level. If they're not on track, it just continues to compile and compound and get worse. If you can identify that challenge early on, there's much greater opportunities to intervene and help a kid get on track.
Now, I know one of your campaign things is about maybe extending the school year, more time in the classroom. Portland Public Schools Teachers Union came out a couple weeks ago and talked about maybe an in-service day where kids would asynchronous learn remotely. I mean, what are your thoughts on that, and how that's going to play out?
Well, I bring a real personal experience to this question, as I know you do as well. As parents, I want to be really clear. I think teachers are doing heroic work. We should be really clear about all the things that we're asking them to do, unprecedented stuff in this sort of time. So they need support, and we need to be a lot more intentional about that. I just don't happen to think that the way to deliver that is by reducing in-class time. I don't like the idea of pitting teachers and students against each other. Parents, I mean, if you're lucky enough to have a job where you can work at home, that's pretty tough. And if you're not able to do that, it's impossible. So this is not a good situation for families, and having schools open is just so central to how our economy works across the state. So we got to do different things to help teachers get the assistance that they need. There's no question they need it, but we shouldn't be putting families and students in that position.
And lately, for the past few years, it does seem as if sometimes it is, they say it's all about the children, but is it, the teachers versus the parents? How do you bridge that gap where you've got, one of the teachers union saying this, and again, we appreciate what they're doing and we know it's been very tough, but what do you do on that? Because there's a feeling that in the state, especially down in Salem, that the unions have kind of an extra push to get things done. How do you combat that? Well,
I think we start with what is best for kids. It's really that simple in my mind. I talked with a superintendent in one district in Oregon who suggested that we should think about the school district the school year starting in November. Not because that's a good thing, but because that's what effectively happens, because it takes that long to catch back up to where they left off in the previous year. So what they've done is a really interesting approach of adding individual modules through the summer, so students and educators alike can sign up kind of on an ad hoc a la carte basis. Maybe it's to catch up on something they missed. Maybe it's to get another chance at something that they struggled with. Or maybe it's an enrichment opportunity, but all of those can add up to additional time and additional experiences that work for the families and the educators in that district. We should not probably continue to be stuck with a calendar that was started when more of us were farmers than are now. Let's get beyond that and make sure that we're not suffering from the summer slide, so educators and teachers don't lose momentum.
Now they'll come out and say to be more time in the class is more money. Being in Portland, you cross the river and go to Vancouver and you look at their facilities and their schools and their funding. It always seems the state of Oregon's always, I don't want to say catch up, but always this funding issue on the education side. You've been in the Treasury, you've been within the the legislative body down there. What do you see? Is there a difference? Is it lack of priority? How do you get that to the forefront when it's because again, for these things to keep people from sliding, it's going to cost some money. And how do you get that funding? I think
I'm not an expert on the system in Washington, but I think in Oregon the key is around stability and allowing to plan. We're going to be in a better position, I think, as a result of the Student Success Initiative that the legislature passed in recent years. That passed and then COVID happened, so we haven't really seen the effects of that. But it's much more effective when a superintendent and a school district can plan over the long run rather rather than riding the roller coaster of an economic cycle that, it's not hard. It would be hard for any of us to manage our own budget when we don't know how much it is. When we're constantly in the cycle of having to just sort of think about how to keep the doors open and the lights on, rather than thinking about what are the best investments for kids all along. I was really proud when I was in the legislature to be part of the effort to bring full-day kindergarten to Oregon. That wasn't always the case. And one of the arguments against it was we're not funding schools adequately. I agreed with that, but my point in that discussion was, well, let's take the money that we have and put it to the place where it's going to make the biggest bang for the buck. And investments in early education pale in comparison to everything else. It is so much more powerful and effective to help students get off to a strong start. And I think that applies with respect to a fuller school year as well.
And I'm guessing from so one of the thoughts is, what is the value I'm getting for my dollar? As I'm investing or paying taxes, is the idea I'm guessing is you could look at spreading the dollar further when you get them younger. As you said, once they get to high school or beyond that age, it's tough to play catch up. It's much easier to instill those kind of habits at a younger age for these kids.
Absolutely, they're going to be in a better position to follow whatever path to success they want to. And we should be clear, it's not that everyone has to go to a four-year institution, but we know that just about every kind of path to success and prosperity requires some kind of education or training after high school. That's also why we're big fans at the Treasury of our college savings plan, which helps people get on that plan and that track from an early age. Having a college savings plan, no matter how much is in it, makes a kid 3 times as likely to go to college and 4 times as likely to graduate from college. So whoever's listening, I hope will be part of our baby grad program. Anyone who opens an account for an Oregon-born baby before their first birthday will get $25 in that account, no questions asked, to just get them started, because we really want every Oregon kid to feel that message from the state that we believe in them, that they're capable and worthy.
Right. So talking about that, about the education process, and not everybody maybe looking at trade schools and things like that, is that putting more resources to community colleges? Where do you see that kind of the change in that, or is it already happening?
Yeah, college savings plans work everywhere, but as a state, I think we really need to be clear about that. There's great need and great opportunity in the trades. It's noble, it's needed, and it's a really solid path. And apprenticeships are a big way to get to that as well.
So now let's change a little bit and talk about housing, which again, this audience is a lot of multifamily owners, investors. Affordability's been on the radar for, since I've been in the business in, the early 90s. I mean, we always hear about we're going to bring in more housing. We're going to develop, candidates always come in, I'm going to foster more development housing. The city of Portland came in with inclusionary zoning, said, hey, this will foster more low income or, affordable housing. They say, what are you going to do? And I know this is one of your, campaign. What are you going to do differently than what's been done before to help alleviate that pressure, bring more housing at different income levels?
Well, I think the first thing to think about is the tension that exists between different policies that we have in Oregon. On one hand, we like those policies that are aimed at including the produce more infill and more density and ultimately more housing. But on the other hand, we have a different set of policies that are aimed at protecting farmland and conservation and local control and so on. And so there's tension here. And I think the first part is to acknowledge that and recognize that they pull in different directions at times. And given where we are, our pronounced lack of housing stock, we have to identify which of those trade-offs have to give. Where do we need to make changes? The other, I think, that is really pronounced in this environment is a different situation. Often it's been the case that we haven't had the resources to make progress that we want, but that's not the case now. We have money. We don't necessarily have the urgency, and I've been frustrated by the lack of follow-through that we've seen. It's not hard for me to understand why people are feeling frustrated, and I think focusing on delivering with speed and agility and being focused on those outcomes, that is lacking at the moment, I think.
And part of it is, what is measurable? And that's something we've had in our industry, a question, from the city to the state, saying, how are you measuring this? And just trying to get clear answers. I know the accounting office or from the auditor from the city of Portland had brought up something, and it's almost got discounted from a policy because it almost seems now in politics, regardless of this is the decision I want to make, and I will find numbers to make it match, regardless. And there's no, especially in this state, it feels as if there's no even being able to sit at a table and say, I might disagree with what your policies are, but at least we can talk about it and have an idea, and I'm not so tunnel vision that this is what I want to do. How do you break that logjam? You know, in Salem, we see it in Portland. What do you do that, you know, in terms of housing? How do we get that out of there?
I think you've answered the question by asking it in some ways. It's agreeing on what are the goals to start from. And I think everybody, if we go back to Maslow, you know, shelter is a
Right.
pretty significant need for everyone. So if we start from that point of view and agree that our success as a community is dependent on people's ability to have shelter, okay, let's start from that. And how do we generate metrics and outcomes from that? How are we going to produce new units? At what cost? At what speed? There's going to be different answers to that based in different communities. But this is one of the things I think really it would be of value is having specific statewide plans that account for those differences in different communities, and then holding ourselves accountable for it. What's been frustrating to me is a continual sort of rollback of, well, we didn't hit this goal, let's extend the timeline, let's send some more money, without addressing what I perceive to be the fundamental issue, which is the lack of follow-up and the lack of focus on execution.
And the one thing I always say to people when they're trying to understand housing, especially in Oregon, you know, we have an urban growth boundary, which again is an artificial, not artificial, it's a constraint on supply. We have the push for density, and then we want affordability. But in looking at neighborhood, you know, a lot of people say they want that, but they don't necessarily want it in their backyard or in their neighborhood. So how do you go to a homeowner in a neighborhood and say, you know, density is not going to ruin the fabric of your neighborhood, but it's going to help the viability of the city? I mean, that's always been so I talk about people in the housing industry like we can go back and forth, but how do you get somebody that's not really in the housing industry other than they own a house or they're in a neighborhood to understand that without density and affordability, what that will do, you know, it's going to cause issues?
Yeah, I think it's articulating those trade-offs really clearly, and I think it's demonstrating places where that works well. Lots of people like the idea of having walkable neighborhoods and amenities and you know, access to restaurants and the library and lots of things that come with that density. So it's easier to imagine yourself, I think, living in a community like that when you've seen it. So having those examples to show to people can be helpful as well.
Now, so one thing that we've been involved in is, you know, with some of the COVID relief for, you know, tenants, there's been the extension of the moratorium. We've read about the lack of, or the inability to get funds out for tenants' benefits. What do you see in that? Is that just bureaucratic red tape that's not getting done? Is it maybe not, you know, measurable goals to how we're going to handle this?
I think it's all of that. I mean, I'm glad, of course, we want to make sure that people are not at risk of losing their homes, so I'm glad the moratoriums were extended in this special session, but I continue to be worried about what led to this special session. What's needed is a focus on execution at the agency. We got into this situation, I think, because the legislature passed those dollars to the agency, but didn't devote sufficient attention to whether the agency had the capacity to get those dollars in the hands of tenants and landlords. It doesn't do very much good at the agency. So I'm glad we extended the moratorium. Maybe that's necessary to send some more dollars there, but unless we're addressing the real execution and the ability of the agency to get those dollars out in the community, we may be just in the same situation.
And what about some of the policies? I know, you know, there's, you know, rent caps in Oregon. I mean, what's your take on, you know, do you open up 608? What's your take on rent control and things like that with this audience?
I think it's short-sighted. I think it's an easy answer that is appealing to people who think about it in fairly short terms. But the larger issue is supply. We need more housing of different types in different places, and we need to build it faster. We need to be opening up our ability to partner with the private sector. I think there's real interest on the part of private investors, and we should look at the obstacles and the barriers to making that happen, being a lot more intentional and strategic about that, and identifying the trade-offs in those policies that we've already talked about a couple of times that pull in different directions sometimes.
Now, one of the bigger topics in this election is going to be, you know, homelessness, public safety, you know, Portland, and I think it's throughout the state as well. What do you see? I mean, there's been a lot of money. There's been bonds passed. What do you see, or do you have a plan? I know it's, you know, it's going to be a tough one. But I think the election may, I don't know if it's going to hinge on that, but that's going to be a very big topic.
Yeah.
Just it's kind of in front and center on everything. I mean, what's your kind of message regarding that?
Well, I think it starts with making sure that we have clear expectations of the community and of law enforcement. The challenge around any of these issues, I think, whether you call it homelessness or crime or public safety or any of those, is that it's really the culmination of all these issues together. It's not just one. Crime is related to homelessness, is related to crime. It's back and forth and all together. So attacking each of these individually is probably not productive, but having the comprehensive approach that deals with, it's not safe for people to be living on the street, no matter where it is. And I think the governor has the ability to make a difference on that in terms of a statewide approach, in terms of a strong statement, in terms of the policies that the governor has. I'm not running for mayor, so that's different.
Right. But historically, the governor's not involved. I mean, historically, it's kind of been on the cities. Do you think maybe this is a big enough problem now that?
Well, I think it requires a statewide approach and a statewide statement, and the state can play a role in assisting cities. It's not that the governor or state government can usurp or come in over the top of city government, but there are places. For example, there are streets and roads in cities that are technically state highways, even though they don't necessarily look any different. There's a place where ODOT has authority, and we should be a lot clearer about that. An example of that in Salem, I think you've probably seen over the summer and so on. There's a camp at the Market Street exit that had a couple hundred people there. That is not safe. There were people killed trying to cross I-5. So even if we have not yet identified an alternative place for them to be, and we should, they can't be can't be next to the interstate. That's in no one's interest.
And again, that was kind of it was kind of is it ODOT, is it Salem, is it Marion County? Nobody really knew the jurisdiction on there.
It's ODOT,
right.
And the governor has the ability to say that needs to be cleaned up.
Okay. So
I think that's a clear sense of where we have to start making a statement and establishing some momentum. It's clearly an issue for everybody. I went and visited downtown Portland a few weeks ago with some business owners. 4 of the 5 were women, and they all talked about being accosted or assaulted in the course of operating their business. And the range of things that they talked about, from being mental health counselors, to social workers, to cleaners up of all kinds of things right in their doorways. They're not able to run their business. People don't feel safe going to downtown Portland, and that all compounds and accumulates in economic activity, in the reputation we acquire or lose regionally and nationally. So this is not something that we should allow to continue. What we're doing right now is not working, and we shouldn't accept it.
And I think that's a big thing. A lot of people will say we just continue to seem to get more, raise more money or pass things to get more money, but the cause is there's no change in what it's being spent. It's just, we'll put more into this, more into this. Is that really making a difference? Is that really changing the barometer one way or the other?
Right. I mean, we should make sure that law enforcement has the resources they need to do their job. It's not the same approach to everything. An armed person is not the correct response to every situation, but they need to have the resources, they need to have the confidence that they can intervene when that is needed, and then we need to hold them accountable. Body cameras need to happen. We need to be continuing our reinvigoration around gun violence reduction teams. We have strong gun control laws, but if we're not enforcing them, that doesn't work. When homicides are at an all-time high, it's time to be serious about this and to act.
Now, are you feeling maybe the state hasn't led hard enough on that, and what's going on currently, where it's kind of, again, we're in Portland right now, where it's kind of onto the city, where again, this may be a bigger problem than just the city of Portland. I mean, is it, from your standpoint, to get into office, to be more of a leadership role as to helping direct and clarify that message? Yeah,
I think that's a good way of saying it. It is city responsibility, and the governor is not going to overturn city policy, but I think making that clear statement and assisting cities and directing resources where they're needed is a place where the state can help.
And then let's talk about a couple other things. We'll go kind of on. One thing, you've talked about the college savings plan and you set up. We hear a lot of talk about, is there ever going to be reform in PERS? What is your take on that? You probably knee deep in it, being in the treasury and, in the house. So
yeah. I mean, I'm sure we can put our audience to sleep really quickly
Yes.
with this topic, and I can go on for a long time because I have talked about it and thought about it a lot. Our role in the Treasury is to generate returns for the system, and we're really good at that. People should feel confident about the team at the Treasury. They are world class, and they're doing an excellent job. The thing about PERS, I think, is to recognize when people want to talk about it, I think it's really a proxy for what's the cost of employing a public servant. We got to remember who those people are. They're teachers and firefighters and police officers and people we rely on. So I've always kind of been mystified why we spend so much rhetorical energy on the one component of compensation
as opposed to the whole
that has the most constraints on it. The courts have been really clear about here's what you can do and here's what you can't do. And the range of things that you could legally do is pretty narrow. If you add the constraint of what would actually make a difference, it gets even narrower. And so there's just not that much to do. I mean, people can think about this really simply. If there was a viable and easy thing to do on PERS, don't you think we would have done it at this point? So let's have a broader conversation about what's the cause of cost. And I think a component of that we don't spend enough time on is healthcare. There's a lot less constraint about that. That's a huge component of what it costs to hire someone in this state and in this country. So that's a better conversation, I think. But I mean, I could go deep on the mechanics of PERS and the bulk of what people tend to focus on is something called the unfunded actuarial liability, and that's really a measure of a gap between what could you pay right now and what will you eventually have to pay. It's a lot like a mortgage, and the good news is you don't have to pay it all in cash right today. You pay it over time, and that's what we're doing at Treasury. That number that people get fixated on is based on a whole lot of assumptions. Particularly the assumed rate, whether performance is in a given year. So we're at 6.9% as an assumed rate right now. As we get near the end and get closer to knowing what the 2021 performance is, it's likely that we're going to exceed 6.9%. So that unfunded liability is going to go down. But in some future year, if we don't hit 6.9%, that liability would go up. So people shouldn't be too fixated on that number. The question is, what's our long-term trajectory? And the vast majority of that unfunded liability is attributable to Tier 1, a system that has not been open to new entrants since 1996.
So historically, right.
That's right.
Okay.
So people are going through that system, but no one is entering into that system. The OPSRP, the Public Service Retirement Plan that has been the norm since 2003, is a totally different structure and not subject to those same challenges.
Okay. So maybe it's too narrow of a discussion, and leads if we look at the whole cost from the employment standpoint.
I think so.
So let's just, we got the election is going to be in November.
That's the general election.
There's
I've got a primary before that.
in May.
That's right.
And there's, I know we've got the Speaker of the House in there. There's some other people that is the, what's his name, the author from the New York Times.
Right.
And there may be some more in there.
Yep.
Kind of what's your difference between, a lot of them haven't really come out with their policies yet, but what's kind of your take on everything?
Well, the biggest difference is, I think, serving in executive office. It's important to pass laws, and I've done that as a legislator, but it's a different thing to serve in executive office, and that's what I've done. There's only one candidate in the Democratic primary who has run statewide and won, and what that has allowed me to do is to practice listening to people who don't agree with me, to build coalitions of people to enact policy, and to actually execute. We didn't yet talk about Oregon Saves, the opt-out retirement plan in the private sector for people who don't have it. No state had done that before. Oregon is the first. And the reason we were able to do that was being really deliberate about talking with employers and talking with savers across the state who thought about this in really different ways. And it results in a program that, by our last poll, has 82% public support, a really strong program that is the result of people, iterating and working together. That's not something you get by being in the legislature. So I think the strongest difference for us is having run and won statewide and implemented programs from beginning to end.
And how do you get because you hear a lot about within our state, where everything is driven by Portland, and how do you get, rural area, how do you get that involvement where you've got this sense, and I think it's probably national as well, where there's a sense of not being represented, everything's, whatever you want to call it, the West Coast, the lead, or things like that. Yep. How do you get that connection back to where we're working together and not opposed to each other, for the good of the state, as opposed to, it's win-lose and get more to a win-win. I mean, how do you change that?
The first part is showing up. I have noticed when I tell people in other parts of the state that I was raised in Idaho, they look at me a little differently. So that's a start. But it's showing up with the humility to say, I'm not here to tell you how to live your life or what your community needs. I'm here to listen. I think ultimately, as Oregonians, we all want versions of the same thing, for our family to be happy and healthy and nearby and with some prospects. And that can mean different things in different parts of the state, but really showing up and listening and looking for those opportunities and looking for where we can remove barriers. I mentioned, that measuring our progress based on how well kids are doing is a really central organizing theme for me, but that includes the fact that I'm really worried. It bothers me that there are kids in rural communities who feel like there aren't opportunities for them there. They were raised there, but they feel like they got to leave. That's not good for the state. Right. So we've got to look really carefully at what opportunities and ambitions and aspirations exist in those rural communities, and recognize that part of our job is to make sure that they have the chance to achieve them. A success in Burns is no less important than one in Beaverton. We're all connected, and we should care about that future, and showing up and demonstrating it can go a long way.
Well, I want to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today.
It's my pleasure.
People want to find out more about your campaign, they can go to the website below, and we'll see you next time on HFO-TV. Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.